Right. So today I'm talking about the psychotherapeutic and psychiatric uses of ayahuasca. If you want, that's my email address. You might want to take a note of it to get any of the references, any of the PDFs of articles that I'm talking about today, or of any of the slides from the other authors. You can get them through me. As we've heard, there have been all these sacred indigenous traditions using ayahuasca. Then there became a bit of a popular movement, which was initiated by, in a lot of ways, the Yahé Letters book by Allen Ginsberg. So basically, spiritual seekers that were going to the Amazon, they were coming back and they were like cured from depression. They went to have a experience of God, and they found God and lost their alcoholism in the process. And this started to attract a lot of interest from psychiatrists, sociologists, and psychologists. The first significant academic trial was called the Ayahuasca Project, which was led by Dr. Charles Groban and Dennis McKenna. And that involved, we heard about the Union de Vegetal religion. So they're really well organized and they have consistent members. So it makes it logistically possible to have an academic trial. And so the McKenna's findings were that he actually demonstrated in academic terms, scientific terms, that the long-term use of ayahuasca resulted in positive behavioral and lifestyle changes, and that was really clearly demonstrated. It was a groundbreaking paper, and there was an unexpected result, which was that the members were finding a lot of relief from alcoholism. A whole bunch of sociological and psychological studies then happened with the SANTO DAIME, which is the other well-organized Brazilian religion. So, for example, Barbosa, the Santos, Halpern, and Busso, and so on. Now, they did a lot of different empirical measures, and they all came up with the same sorts of themes, which was, firstly, that ayahuasca is safe, that cognitive function is not impaired by this substance, that in fact the psychological benefits, there's a lot of people reporting healing trauma and an antidepressant action. Also release from anxiety and panic, and then this slightly enigmatic theme of finding meaning and purpose in people's lives and having relief from addiction. Now, of course, relief from addiction is addictions often fill the holes that these other problems are, right? So when you relieve these other problems, the addiction doesn't need to be there. Now, another thing was that they really noticed the social skill and community building enhancements of the ayahuasca ceremonies. Now, I'll point out it's not just the ayahuasca here, it's the sacred ritual that was happening with the SANTO DAIME. So this is an example of, a highly organized, co-created mandala of prayer that the SANTO DAIME community are doing together. Now, I'm going to talk about a few other really interesting, groundbreaking academic studies, and one of them was done by Jordi Riba in Spain. So he did electromagnetic tomography of human brains drinking ayahuasca. Now, in order to get this in an academic journal, he took the ayahuasca, he freeze-dried it, and he measured it with chromatography and all that, and he came up with these freeze-dried pills and gave them exactly 0.85 milligrams of DNP per kilogram of the body weight of the participant. So there you have this whole concept of having a standardized thing, a standardized drug that's similar to the pharmaceutical drug trials. And then he put them inside these brain scanning machines, and firstly he proved that there was no toxicity, and then he also noticed this increased activity in the left hemisphere of the brain, the areas that are implicated in somatic awareness, emotional arousal, and basically the processing of emotion. So those areas of the brain get stimulated by the ayahuasca. On the right hemisphere, again, emotional arousal and an ability, the ayahuasca was enabling repressed memories to come to the surface of the consciousness. And also for people to able to basically re-experience those emotions. So actually remember, not just historically, but remember what it felt like when they had that traumatic experience as a kid, for example. Yeah, and he showed what was going on in the brain there. Another thing that he showed was that that ayahuasca generates neurogenesis, which is like the growth of new nerve cells in a similar way that Prozac does, for example. Another really groundbreaking one, this is the first, was done in Brazil by Draulio and his colleagues and Fernando and so on. They did the first ever double-blind, placebo-controlled experiment with ayahuasca. So just so that you know, in order to get any kind of antidepressant drug on the market, you have to do double-blind, placebo-controlled. Now, placebo-controlled means some of the people are taking the antidepressant pill and some of them are taking a pill that just doesn't do anything, right? And then not only do the patients not know what's going on, but the scientists doing the experiment, they don't know which pill is which either. So there's double blind. Now, if you think about it, that's almost absurd concept when you're talking about drinking ayahuasca, because you know that you're on ayahuasca, right? Well, what was really interesting is that some of these people doing these trials, they were literally homeless people from the streets of Brazil, and they didn't even really know what ayahuasca was, apart from it made you feel a bit weird and made you vomit. So they basically, Draulio invented this potion that made people vomit and looked brown and tasted terrible, and gave half of it to them and half of them actual proper sacrament from a Union de Vegetal church. And they did, it was not really what I think most of us would define as a sacred ceremony, but it was really interesting in that some of these people were, as I said, homeless. They'd never been, they very, very rarely had any kind of treatment in their life. And they were suddenly finding themselves in a nice hospital being taken care of by, Fernando and Draulio, these really lovely people. And there was a massive placebo effect. So the question is, was that a placebo effect? And I've actually talked to Draulio about this, and behind the scenes, what they say is they call it the love effect. Yeah? So some people didn't have the ayahuasca, and they walk out of the lab and report, they're not feeling as depressed as they were a few days ago. And that's the love, right? Now, however, compared to the placebo, as this graph shows, the ones that had the ayahuasca did have a really marked antidepressant benefit, and they used all these traditional scientific scales to demonstrate that. And this was the first ever publication that we could say with confidence, yes, ayahuasca works as an antidepressant. It took 7 attempts at different journals to get it published, but it was. And that's a significant moment. Now, there's now a huge amount of ayahuasca research going on, and it's really interesting because it's going on despite the lack of funding, whereas, pharmaceutical companies actually pay for the majority of psychiatric research, right, for their own products. Now, in London, there are these studies going on at the moment with ayahuasca. So Ashley Murphy-Byner from Imperial College, so she's basically a psychologist, and she's involved firstly in the psilocybin assisted trials that they're doing at Imperial, but she's also doing her PhD, and she's noticed that ayahuasca increases this concept of mindfulness and flexible thinking, and also mindfulness meditation when used in together with ayahuasca ceremonies, that actually helps the integration process. Simon Raffel and Nige Netzband, they're just started a medical research council funded trial with ayahuasca at the Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital. And their question is, does ayahuasca relieve traumatic memories by improving the reprocessing of those memories? Yeah, so it's like we all remember the shit that happened, but it's like, can you somehow like alchemize that by rewriting the script? And that's their hypothesis, and that it would then improve general depression and general well-being. And they're also going to do these quantitative measures with DNA methylation, right? Then there's Chris Timmerman, also at Imperial College. So he's not actually exactly using ayahuasca, he's using DMT fumarate. So it's a chemically synthesized DMT turned into something that you can inject. And so he's injecting people with this, with a government license, and then putting them inside these brain scanning machines. Now, again, Chris is a really lovely guy with his own spiritual beliefs and so on. Now, although the science, what you can write about is limited, you know, they are thankfully talking about some ways of measuring spiritual experience, which have been developed at Johns Hopkins University. But, you know, basically, if I was going to have DMT inside a big machine, then I'd want to do it with my mate Chris, right? So there's this interesting concept where it's scientific reductionism is required in order to do government-funded trials, but at least it's happening with really lovely people. Right. Now, and some of them are actually here. If you want to talk to them, you can. Now, there is, for example, there's a whole plethora now of literature about ayahuasca. These are 4 books about the medical healing of ayahuasca that I do recommend, and there's a total of 147 books about ayahuasca at the moment on Amazon Books. So there's this general sense in popular culture that ayahuasca is a highly effective new medicine or an ancient medicine that's been rediscovered. And there's now actually this concept that some people are talking about it as if it's a panacea. So panacea is the term of like a medicine that can cure anything, and is kind of, you know, like this snake oil salesman, you know, that's getting a bit kind of pushed out there by these cowboy shamans and these kind of ayahuasca corporations that, yeah, this can just do everything. All you have to do is go drink the ayahuasca and solve all your problems. Well, I really want to say that's not how it works. It's really, ayahuasca is incredibly complicated, and the ceremonies are incredibly complicated, and things really can go wrong. Yeah? And that's partly why we're doing this, yeah? So one of the big things that can go wrong is if you've got schizophrenia, it's probably going to make, ayahuasca is probably going to make it a lot worse. Or if you've got a psychotic tendency, then it's probably going to bring that out according to the limited studies that have been done. And there's also a belief, there's some documented cases of people with bipolar disorder going manic after drinking ayahuasca, and there's a general sense you don't mix those things. There are also a lot of psychological and spiritual crises that are happening all around the world of people drinking ayahuasca. And in fact, AYAHUASCSA, who are this amazing Spanish organization that run the World Ayahuasca Conference and the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, so they have a free counseling support service that if you know of anyone that's having a crisis, whether that's like, they're like it's quite common. Like I had a friend, for example, this is kind of worst case scenario, right? You go to an ayahuasca, she went to ayahuasca ceremony and she realized that she'd been given the date rape drug and gang raped when she was a kid, when she was a teenager, and she had this blackout one night and she realized from the ayahuasca, she woke up, she saw the whole thing, yeah? So this is like really heavy shit can happen. This is even when the ceremony is going well, because actually that was ultimately a very liberating thing for her to understand, to heal, to integrate, to get over. But, if you can imagine, that's not the sort of thing you want to just discover one night and then have to go to the office at 9 a.m. the next morning. And you want to have some people who are really experienced with counseling that can support that, for example. And also, there are some people who get incredibly confused about these downloads that they get from the ayahuasca, from the divine sources. How do I make sense of that? What does this mean? Because ayahuasca is often a bit of works in metaphor a lot of the time. It's not necessarily a literal message that you get, is not necessarily exactly what happened. So it can be really confusing. And again, it's important to have integration and support when you're figuring out what happened last night when you're on ayahuasca. And then also there is some phenomenon where people get stuck in the spirit realm. They haven't properly grounded, and they end up with what in psychiatry would be they're going through a drug-induced psychosis. So it can get really complicated. Now, my argument is really the reason why these things are going wrong is not so much because of the ayahuasca itself and the sacred traditions thereof. The problem is that it's an underground, illegal, unsupported, underfunded healing modality. So, these are just, a list of all the arrests that have happened in Europe since 1999. Now, basically, the people running the ceremonies, they can't, they can't have websites. They can't have information available. You can't also have accreditation. Like if you go, you've also got this phenomenon. It's kind of like the phenomenon of the backyard abortion. Abortions are always going to be wanted by women. Well, not always, but there's always a need there sometimes. So it's better to have it out in the open, regulated, trained. You get a certified, like the same, you get a certified osteopath. You wouldn't want to go to some dude who's just going to crack your neck, who doesn't know what he's doing. Don't want to, it's the same with ayahuasca ceremonies, right? So now, where does this lead to? Well, what I'm really interested in is I would like to see ayahuasca made available on the National Health Service. Yeah, bit of a long-term strategy, but it's possible. Now, what about 20 years ago, what do we say about weed? Well, now we can go down to Holland and Barrett and get cannabidiol, medical marijuana. So would it be possible to have medical ayahuasca in the future? So this is especially important because, let's face it, ayahuasca ceremonies are at the moment massively overpopulated by white, wealthy people, yeah? And the people that are, financially challenged, can't afford to go to the ceremonies, or have got a disability or a mental illness and can't afford to go to can't hold down a job to afford to be able to go, or they can't even get it together to get there. They're the people that needed the help the most, in my opinion. And often these are the people who are the most traumatized and who, if anyone should be at the front of the queue for getting ayahuasca, it's not necessarily the white wealthy people, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah? So the way for that to happen, I think, would be for ayahuasca to be available somehow through the National Health Service. Now, I'm going to explore this as a concept. Now, it's a highly complicated, highly problematic, not just logistically, but philosophically. Now, all right, so for a start, it's very, very clear that the sacred ritual setting influences the quality of the ayahuasca experience. Yeah? It's like, the way I describe it is, the ayahuasca is like an amplifier, and it depends what you're putting into it, and you know, people's ears are attuned, they're highly sensitive, and so, you know, are you listening to healing, sacred, soft, gentle, psychic massage music, prayer, affirmations, a community of solidarity, and where you can really just trust your people, everyone's in it for the right reasons, they're supporting each other, you know, or is there incompetence, dodginess, sexual predatory behavior? Is the ayahuasca itself badly made, or is it fake? You know, there are a lot of factors which influence the quality of the experience. And those are the sorts of things. Sacred ritual setting? Does the National Health Service have any bloody idea how to do a sacred ritual setting? Right? No. And then we're talking about like angels and demons. Okay, so if I believe that, for example, that half of the healing of ayahuasca ceremonies is the medicinal benefits of the ayahuasca. The other half of the healing is the angels, right? The divine energy that is cultivated through the ceremony, and people literally have experiences of spiritual doctores who come and they do like angels that come and do psychic surgery on you, right? Now, basically, just a warning, by the way, if you talk to a psychiatrist about angels and demons, that is used as a diagnostic criteria for locking you up in an asylum. So, what's that? It's not always true. Okay, it's not always true. Okay, all right. I'm sorry, I'm making a generalization from my own personal experience in psychiatry. And I shouldn't make a generalization because there are open-minded, there are spiritually minded psychiatrists, and so on. That's true. But what I'm saying is, in general, this is it's a very different language, and it's certainly also a different language than the double-blind, placebo-controlled trial language and all this sort of thing. And what I'm saying is, I wouldn't leave it entirely up to a bunch of UK NHS psychiatrists at the Maudsley Hospital to run a clinical trial with ayahuasca. That I would have very little faith in, unless they actually did a lot of training with people from the Amazon, especially Indigenous people. I guess that's what I'm saying, really. So, okay. Now, another question is, the ayahuasca itself is often considered a sacrament or a sacred medicine, like Santa Medicina is a common term. So here's some examples from the SANTO, DAIME, the UDV, of them ritualistically preparing the ayahuasca and putting a lot of love and energy into it. And somehow the ayahuasca carries the energy that's around the cultivation, the brewing, the storing, transportation thereof. Yeah? Now, again, how do we then, in medical terms, talk about an entheogen? So entheogen, it's a very useful term, I think. So there's the term psychedelic, which means basically mind expanding, mind opening up of your emotions. But entheogenic means a substance which generates a connection with the divine within oneself and also the cosmic divine in general. Now, so if ayahuasca is an entheogen and a technology for connecting with divine, how do we work that out within the NHS? Good question. Now, on the flip side of it, some scientific thinking would be really helpful for the ayahuasca community. And this is the flip side of the thing, where I'm basically what I'm arguing, if you can see where I'm going with this, is that I would like to see the scientific thinking and the indigenous spirituality actually join forces. Yeah. So one area of thinking about this is to look at for example, ayahuasca is not just one single thing. It's a lot of different brewing techniques for making different teas, and it's highly variable substance. Yeah. One of the reasons why it's highly variable is there's all these different subspecies of vine that are used to make the tea. And then sometimes there's this thing called Peganum harmala or Syrian rue that's being used, and that's not ayahuasca. It's got some similar chemicals in there, but it is different. There's all sorts of complications going on here. There are things like, and then when you cook the tea for different periods of time, it actually changes chemically in the process the harmine, the tetrahydroharmine becoming harmine, and these sorts of things. Don't need to go into too much detail. The point is, there's not just one ayahuasca, it depends how you cook it, yeah? Now, there's also a phenomenon of fermentation. Unfortunately, in Europe, a lot of people are drinking highly fermented ayahuasca. Now, there is some, for example, the Alto Santo tradition of Santo Daime, they do let it ferment for 2 days, but then they stop it and they make sure that it never ferments any further. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the UK, they're drinking a bottle of ayahuasca that was made in the jungle some months ago and has been in the post unrefrigerated and is all fizzy, and basically it's ayahuasca beer. So if it looks like this, if it's fizzing like that, it's going to be chemically different than how it was when it was made 3 months ago in the Amazon, okay? It's actually going to chemically change your brain. Now, a lot of people aren't thinking in those terms, and I think it would be useful to do that in terms of like standardization. And I've been looking at one possibility, one way around this is to freeze dry the ayahuasca immediately after cooking it and then put water in later on. There's another issue of these things called the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that they are highly chemically reactive with other substances. And there's, for example, there's all these lists that you go on if you go to a ceremony. You can't eat this, you can't eat that, you can't take these pills, you have to come off your Prozac, you can't, you can't drink alcohol. But then some of it is like, it hasn't actually been retested. So the whole thing about can you eat overripe bananas, can you eat soy sauce with ayahuasca, and that was all based on a theory that's actually been debunked. And there's yet to be a proper scientific trial, and that would be a really useful thing for reductionist science to figure out, I think. Because the indigenous people, they cooked the tea in the morning, they drank it that night, simple, done, right? And they had their own, they didn't have soy sauce in the jungle, right? So how to apply it in the West could do some thinking. Now, this I think everyone should understand this slide. This is really important. Okay, ayahuasca contains at least 4 different psychoactive substances. 3 of them are from the vine, and they're called the harmala alkaloids. Harmine and harmaline are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, yeah? They do 2 things. One is they facilitate the DMT passing through the gut into the bloodstream and into the brain. Without MAOIs, you could take grams and grams, hundreds and hundreds of pounds worth of DMT and nothing would happen because it gets oxidized in the gut. So the MAOIs are required to get it through into the bloodstream, but they are also activate on the nervous system, yeah? Tetrahydroharmine activates the nervous system, it's serotonergic, but it doesn't do the gut thing. And then there's DMT, which is in the leaf, or in the acacia, in the case of what we call Ayahuasca. And that is, and then there's, of course, the ratio of all these things, depends how you cook it, how much leaf to vine, what subspecies, and so on. Yeah? So it's good to think, when you go to an ayahuasca ceremony, ask the facilitator, tell me about the tea. Tell me everything you want, everything about the tea. If they don't even know who made it, if they bought it on the internet, that's a bad sign right there. If they say it's got Syrian rue in it, or Pegnum harmala, then it should not be called ayahuasca. It could be called pseudo-ayahuasca or anahuasca or something else, and it may be valid entheogen, but it's not ayahuasca, and it hasn't been safety trialed. And by the way, it's much more likely to induce abortion than ayahuasca is, for example. So these are the sort of things you need to know to get a safe experience, yeah? I'm not going to go down this side, too complicated. Now, 5-HT2A receptor agonist, that's what DMT is. What the hell does that mean? Think about the sockets on the side of your computer, right? So like data ports shaped in a particular way. There's this thing called the 5-HT2A receptor. It's like a port in your brain. It's a socket. The DMT plugs there. Now, it's also the same place in the brain where the classic hallucinogens, psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline from the cactus, they all plug into the same place in the brain called 5-HT2A. Yeah? It's also one of the places where serotonin plugs in. Now, all these things, can you see, they're very similar shaped molecules, but they do different things because they're slightly different shaped. Yep? Now, what is this DMT? Well, DMT is arguably endogenous to the human brain, as in made in the same way that serotonin is made from protein. And it looks almost identical. So there's a lot of us that believe that it's endogenous, which means, it's a natural part of the human brain in the same way that melatonin or serotonin are naturally made, and therefore it actually has a role. And what do I believe is its role? Well, its role is to bring back a sense of self, which happens through the sigma-1 receptor, perhaps. It's to get a sense of stability and consciousness and cosmic intelligence. You could say these are incredibly difficult to quantify things. This is just my personal opinion. Now, I want to go back to, Danny was talking about the SANTO DAIME. Now, the founder of the SANTO DAIME, he actually had a very scientific way of approaching ayahuasca ceremonies. His way of cooking the tea was very precise, he always used a particular subspecies, a particular amount of vine and leaf, a particular cooking temperature, avoided fermentation. He knew all about not mixing it with other substances and all this sort of stuff. So there is this, and for example, also in the Shipibo traditions and the Yawanawa traditions, for example, they're really on it with like the chemistry. Even though they don't know it under a microscope, they think in those terms. So I think there is a precedent for this. And where could this be heading? Well, this could be heading to what I call medical ayahuasca. Now, why am I so passionate about this? Because ayahuasca has literally saved me from suicide. So I have bipolar disorder. This is how I used to feel before I discovered ayahuasca. I'm a creative person who was given 17 pharmaceutical drugs by psychiatrists, and both the psychiatrists and the pharmaceutical industry made a lot of money out of my side effects and basically made things worse. And then 13 years ago, I discovered ayahuasca. I've been gradually healing and so on. And actually, I discovered that a particular brew of ayahuasca can help with bipolar disorder, certainly with mine, and that's where my PhD started, but it turns out with these 61 other people as well, ayahuasca is, at least according to my research, looking pretty promising as an effective antidepressant for treating bipolar disorder that does not trigger manic symptoms in the same way that almost all the other antidepressants trigger manic symptoms in bipolar people. Now, it is a bit, sometimes there are negative experiences, and I'm researching those, and it basically, what it's leading to is I'm like doing lab analysis of different batches of ayahuasca and cooking all these different recipes on my stove, and, you know, getting all scientific and subjective with the, you know, meeting these things, drinking ayahuasca in a sacred ceremony, but fine-tuning the brewing technique to find a unique medical ayahuasca that's particularly suited for bipolar people, which has, again, a precedent with medical cannabis. So, you know, they have the strain, you know, there's in medical cannabis, you have CBD and THC, right? And CBN and stuff like that. So there is a precedent for particular strains of cannabis, that some that help for epilepsy, some that help for cancer pain, some that help for multiple sclerosis, and so on. And they fine-tune the different ingredients, and that's an analogy for a precedent for what I'm doing with ayahuasca. So going back to, you know, if you had something like that, it would make it a lot easier to do something like a clinical trial or some kind of university measurable experiment where there's some consistency. Science needs consistency in order to figure out what's actually really going on and to be able to publish it in an academic journal. So if there was to be, for example, at the Maudsley Hospital, a clinical trial, then I would say that you'd have to specifically cook the tea in a particular way, deal with fermentation, have a very strict list of contraindicated substances. People would have to have a particular diet and controlled settings. But I would also say, in order to be spiritually safe and for it to be emotionally therapeutic, it would also have to involve the sacred energy of prayer and the wisdom from the indigenous spiritual traditions from the Amazon, and hopefully these two worlds, these two different languages could cooperate so that we could make ayahuasca available to heal people on the NHS. Thank you.